Well, good evening. My name is Abby Edens. I'm Director of Education at the National WWII Museum, and our program this evening is an observance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This program is sponsored by Toby Philanthropies and is part of the Toby Family Holocaust Program at the National WWII Museum. Tonight, I am honored to introduce our speaker, Mr. Stephen Hess. Stephen and his twin sister, Marion, were born less than a minute apart on January 14, 1938 in Amsterdam, Holland. They were the children of German Jewish refugees who had fled the Nazis. Following the invasion and occupation, the Hess family was taken to the Dutch transit camp of Westerbork before being sent to Bergen-Belsen. They are among the fewer than 5% of Jews deported from Holland and still alive at war's end. And they are among the few twins who survived the concentration camps, and at this point, possibly the last. So tonight, Mr. Hess will be discussing he and his family's experience during World War II and how they survived against all odds. I will now turn this program over to our distinguished speaker, Mr. Hess.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, National WWII Museum, for the honors mine. And we do hope to see this beautiful museum when the present conditions permit. Tonight, we have a difficult topic, the Holocaust. Let me define some terms so that we all know what we're talking about. The Holocaust is defined as the period between 1939 and 1945 that saw the Nazis and their twisted ideology, together with their helpers, participate in the murder of approximately 6 million Jews as part of Nazi ideology, and about 5 million others. It is the greatest recorded crime in recorded history. It is complicated, it is obsessive. The more questions you ask, the fewer answers you get, but hopefully I will try and answer some of them. I usually, this is not my business, I do this on occasion. When I have more time, I try to give a background on anti-Semitism, which was so key to it, which is defined as hatred, contempt, and fear of Jews as Jews. But because we don't have the time, I'm going to go pretty much right into our family story. First, a couple of things to give you a sense of what we're talking about. The Holocaust was not monolithic, although it all took place at the same time. It varied greatly from country to country, and we're talking about the occupied countries, and from city to city. But essentially, it had everything to do with the attitude of the Nazis towards the local population and the attitude of the local population to their Jewish neighbors. Two brief and extreme examples: the attitude of the Nazis towards the Poles and most of the population of the Eastern countries was one of contempt. They considered them to be an inferior race and Untermenschtum. And with the result, partly, but largely because of it, nearly the entire Jewish population, which was 3 million, 10% of the Polish population, were murdered. At the same time, in the same Holocaust, the same time period, you go to Denmark with a Jewish population of about 8,000, and all but fewer than 100 were saved. Partly in Poland was heavily Catholic countries. The church had great influence. Anti-Semitism was rife. It's still a topic, but Denmark was much more of a secular country. They had no particular issue with their Jewish neighbors. And when the time came, over 2 nights, when they learned that the Germans were finally going to bring the final solution, which, by the way, is a German term, and I always use it in finger quotes. When the final solution was to come to Denmark, the Danish population was warned, and in 2 days, just about the entire Jewish population were taken in boats and ships to neutral Sweden and saved. So again, you can't really talk about the Holocaust. You have to say how, when, where, what happened. There were huge differences. Holland, uh, you'd think that Holland, most of us think of Holland as Anne Frank. We kind of forget she was murdered in Bergen-Belsen. But the point, the Diary of a Young Girl, the Annex, I still believe in the goodness of man, and we think of Holland as tulips and wooden shoes. And if you had to choose where to be during the Holocaust as a Jew, well, you wouldn't choose to be anywhere, but if you had to, you would have thought that the Netherlands would be better than most places, certainly better than Poland or the Eastern countries. But the fact is that Holland was the most deadly Western European country. Out of approximately 107, there were about 140,000 Jews in a population of 9 million. Of them, 107,000 were deported to the camps, the various concentration camps, including my family. At the end of the war, about 5,000 were still alive, fewer than 5%. People will always, now the Jews, as a matter of Nazi policy and ideology, were condemned to death without exception. So any Jew caught in the occupied countries and still alive afterward would have to have some explanation. And the only explanation that I have come up with, and most people who I know who went through a similar experience, is luck. Because you couldn't be smart enough or rich enough or anything to defy being condemned. The Jews were condemned without exception. So it was basically down to luck, but luck, as we all know, is not equally distributed. It's better to be good looking than not. It's better to be rich than to be poor. It's certainly better to be healthy than sick. It's better to be young than to be old. So those people who had a greater measure of luck, and sometimes it was just timing or a turn in the road or a knock on the door, but whatever it was, those who survived were basically lucky. If you look at my PowerPoint, Holland is a small country, about twice the size of New Jersey, but once before the invasion, if you see the map over here, there was no place that you could escape to. You had Germany on the east, you had occupied Belgium to the south, you had North Sea to the west. There was just no escape. A small country, a flat country, a populated country without forests or caves or woods. So it was basically a trap, and there was no place to go. Once the war rumble started and Jews started leaving Germany in the 30s, the Jews didn't really think that anything bad would happen. In general, they had lived with anti-Semitism their whole lives, and they figured this Hitler too shall pass. But of course it didn't. And gradually the clamps were tightened on the Jews, and Hitler began talking about getting rid of the Jews. But early in the days, whatever was in their mind, I would have no idea, of course, but getting rid of the Jews meant extrusion, to make Germany what was called Judenrein, a clean of Jews. The thought of murdering all the Jews was a big step. And among other things, it required war, it required remote places, it required the acquiescence of the population. It was a big step, and in the mid-30s, they weren't quite ready for it. But the Jews were a small minority in Germany. There were 500,000 Jews in a population of 60 million. They lived principally in the largest cities, Berlin, Frankfurt, Düsseldorf, hardly any in the countryside. They were highly assimilated, like my parents. I never think of myself as being Jewish or even being Dutch. I'm an American, and German Jews thought of themselves as Americans. 100,000 of them fought for the Kaiser in World War I, and 12,000 gave their lives for Germany in World War I. But by 1935, with the Nuremberg laws, the Jews were totally marginalized, and from being citizens, they were brought back to being subjects, basically the same medieval status. And they could no longer work, they could no longer have non-Jewish employees, and all sorts of other restrictions. By that time, the Jews started to try and leave Germany, and about half of them did. But then in 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, after getting, quote unquote, getting rid of about 250,000 Jews, they inherited 190,000 Austrian Jews. So getting rid of the Jews was not so easy, and minds began to turn. At that time, my father was a successful businessman, paid for the passage of his parents, his sister, his brother-in-law to America. It was very, very difficult to get to America. A lot of paperwork. You had to have a visa. You had to have a guarantee from relatives or friends that you would not be a financial burden. But my father was very entrenched in the status quo. Said he was a successful businessman. He was very German, and thought of himself as German, and he didn't particularly wanted to give up everything that he had worked so hard for. Those Jews who left Germany, with some exceptions like Albert Einstein, of course, generally were more portable. They could give up the jobs. If they drove a taxi in Germany, they could drive a taxi in New York. But those who were deeply ingrained in the status quo, who were highly successful, who had a business or whatever, were more loath to leave. My father, again, after 1935, he could no longer work, but his sympathetic employer, he worked for a large silk company, suggested to him that they transfer him to Amsterdam, where they had their Dutch office, and bring back the German manager, thus solving the problem. When you speak about the Holocaust, you also have to try and give it context. Why Holland? Well, Holland had been neutral in the Great War, and it's also important to remember that in the mid-30s, the Great War, or now World War I, was only 2 decades in the rearview mirror. If you talk about Vietnam, that was maybe 35 years ago, and many of us, certainly my age, remember it as if it happened yesterday. So the fact of Dutch neutrality was nearly a guarantee in the minds of the Dutch and the other Germans who fled to Holland, that they would be safe with the coming war. By the mid 1930s, Germany was rearming, and people were sure that sooner or later a war would start again. So my parents moved to Holland and thought they would be safe. I have to tell you one interesting story. The Jews were more than welcome to leave Nazi Germany. As I have said, there was no hindrance to leaving Germany, but 2 large obstacles. Number one, they could not take anything. I think they could take about approximately 10 marks. I mean, pocket change in their pocket. If they had a business, they had to sell it for pennies on the dollar or pfennig on the marks. And if they had property or a house or automobile, they left the keys on the desk, whatever, and they left with nothing. So the Germans were also enriched by the departure of the Jews. However, because of my father was an official transfer with the permission and the paperwork of the German government, they were allowed to take their stuff, which was highly unusual, if not actually unheard of. And my mother, who was extremely good looking, all sons will say that, but my mother really was. And it was one of the many things that somewhere along the road helped save our lives. It was small things, but I'll give you an example. My father moved to Amsterdam to the same way, years ago when people worked for Kodak or other companies. The dad would get transferred to California. Mom would stay behind until the school year was over with. It was similar. My father went to Amsterdam to set up house, find a place to live, run the office. My mother stayed behind in Düsseldorf, which is right over, see, right over here. It's quite a large city in Germany, to pack their things. Well, the Germans were convinced that the Jews had money. Whoever heard of that? But they were convinced of it. And one day, again, my mother was very elegant. She was still very young. She was called to the German police office, and she took her accountant with her. And they were grilling my mother of where the bank accounts and where the money was. And my mother was also very fashionable. And all these stories, by the way, I wasn't even a glint in anybody's eye. I had long talks with my mother, and my father left a long memoir. So I'm very careful not to that the facts are correct. Anyway, my mother and her accountant went to the police station, and the police she was elegant. She had a hat on with a feather, and the police was hounding her about where the supposed bank accounts were. And the accountant, a family friend who was not Jewish, went to the police officer and sort of winked at him, and he said, "Take a look at her. She spends every dime he makes." And they both had a good laugh over that, and he accepted it. And my mother was let go. When she returned to the apartment, every day that she was packing, the Düsseldorf police, not particularly a Nazi, they were not everybody was a Nazi, sent a policeman or a detective over to the house. And my mother was telling me the story. She was about 87 or 80 years old, and she was still very sharp and had a good sense of humor and a heavy German accent. And my mother was allowed to take linens and dishes and things like that. But the policeman was there to make sure that nothing of value was packed. And my mother, in a heavy German accent, was telling me a story. And again, she was young and beautiful. And she said to me, with a heavy German accent, she said to me, "Stephen, I knew he wasn't looking at my packing. I played him like such a fish." And I remember asking my mother, "Tell me, what do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well," I said, "would you like a cup of coffee, Herr whatever his name was, Mr. Herr Schmidt? Can I make you a sandwich, Herr Schmidt?" No, Frau Hess, thank you very much." And he was enjoying the view. In the meantime, my mother was wrapping up all the silver, all sorts of things which we still have, with some beautiful pictures. And so a lot of the things that my parents had in Germany actually were saved and got to Holland. My parents were, my mother was the only child of a successful small department store owner in a city called Recklinghausen. So my father was the son of a horse farmer, but moved up in the world. He was a bit of a dandy. He rode horses and loved ballroom dancing. And when the two of them met, my mother's parents were not overjoyed. They were 13 years apart, but it was a good marriage. One of the things, we're talking about luck. My parents were smart, they were educated, they were young, and they were healthy, and they were German. And they spoke German, not German that they learned somewhere. They were German. In addition to that, my father, frankly, looked as much like a Nazi as a Nazi. He had dark blonde hair, light eyes. He certainly was not what one might call, whatever you mean by it, stereotypically Jewish looking. He looked like the German that he was. So he also was able to get away with things that somebody, for example, an Eastern Polish Jew probably wouldn't have a chance of doing. He was comfortable in Germany. He knew the whole country, again, was born there. So it all went towards his bucket of luck. My parents finally got to, in 1936, got to Holland, And my sister and my twin sister, born 45 minutes apart, I'm the cute one in my mother's arms, right over here. And that's my sister over here. And that was taken by my father on the beach in Zandvoort in Holland in 1939. One of the things when I give a talk, I at times say the Holocaust had to be invented. And what I mean by that is that it was so cataclysmic that you couldn't imagine it. I mean, none of us can look over the horizon. None of us know what's going to happen, good, bad, or indifferent tomorrow. We only know the moment right now. And my mother, many, many years ago, gave me the family archives, and among them is this happy picture of my smiling mother and two gorgeous kids on the beach. And I said to my mother, and I always tell people, don't look at the Holocaust from 5,000 miles up because you know what happened. Put yourself in the moment. And I said to my mother, I said, Mom, why are you smiling? It's 1939. The world was about to come apart. And my mother said, what are you talking about? We were in Holland, we were safe, we had two wonderful children, Dad had a good job. My parents, nor anybody else, could not look over the horizon. And so you see a very happy Jewish woman in the neighboring country enjoying a day at the beach just months before the Nazis invaded Poland. The invasion of Holland was a huge shock. The Dutch, having been neutral during the Great War, did not expect the Germans to invade. As my mother also told me in sort of ironic gallows humor, it wasn't obviously not a serious comment, but she said that the Dutch Jews blamed the German refugees in Holland for bringing Hitler to Holland, as if to say that had the German refugees, like my parents, only stayed in Germany, Hitler would not have chased them over the border. Total nonsense, of course, but the Dutch and the Dutch Jews were so frantic and so terrorized that they spoke nonsense, and they felt had the German Jews and other immigrants only stayed where they belonged, Hitler would have left Holland alone. The Dutch military lasted 5 days. There was very little resistance, very small army, nothing to speak of. Also, Holland had the third largest Nazi movement in Europe. The largest one was, of course, Germany. The second one was Austria. And the third, with 10% of the vote in the 30s, was the Dutch Nazi Party. Also, Holland is very pillared and structured, and it's a trading country with a long tradition of going along to get along. They didn't like the Germans, of course, but they said, look, we're stuck with it. We'll do the best we can. But the result of it was that the Jews in Holland, there were 140,000 Jews. The Nazis did not arrest Jews in mixed marriages because they didn't want to start having issues with the church. So Jews in mixed marriages were left alone. A few Jews, like the Franks, and Frank and her family went to hiding. And you know how that turned out. About a third of them were caught, usually betrayed by Dutch neighbors, and sent directly to the concentration camps. But about 107,000 Jews out of a total of 140 were over time arrested, deported, and except for 5,000, the rest of them never came back. And so I will continue. Cute. Among the photographs were these. It's actually part of a whole series. And when I was young, I used to ask my mother, why were we in cowboy outfits or typical Dutch costumes? And by the way, there's a very long story to this. Last year, someone in Holland saw these pictures because my twin sister wrote an op-ed with this picture in it. And this policeman in a small Dutch town called Urk received a copy of this op-ed from a woman in California with Dutch forebears, and he said, those costumes are from our town. And he actually hunted me down, and we've been in contact ever since. And he wrote a long magazine article, which I have translated. But anyway, these Dutch costumes from Urk belong to the family of our nanny who came from Urk. And she, once the Nazis had occupied Holland, and we were confined pretty much to where we lived, to our apartment, our nanny brought over these costumes, and my mother got a photographer to take some pictures, this whole series. And I said, well, I said to my mother, well, that's nice. And she said, no, 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 there's more. I said, tell me more. She said the photographer was called Mr. Fisher. And sometime later, the Nazis caught him making false photographs for ID cards, and they put him against a ditch and they shot him. And I mentioned this to my new policeman friend in Urk a year ago, and he recovered the entire history that this Mr. Fisher, Leon Fisher, sent me a photograph of him, was caught, and he with 17 others were executed late in the war, and then was later on reburied with a monument. It's a small world. Eventually, in the first couple of years, the Nazis invaded on May 10th, 1941, but the deportations didn't start until late 1942. The reason for this was that the Nazis had set upon a huge project to murder all the Jews of Europe at the Wannsee Conference, where it was decided to do that. Although they were murdering Jews since 1939, they had a population count of 11 million Jews to be murdered. The Jews were to disappear, those whose luck ran out. But that included Jews in England and Scotland and Ireland and in neutral countries. So the Nazis actually had 9 million Jews under their occupation in the various countries, of whom 6 million died. That's 2 out of 3 Jews in Europe, 1 out of 3 Jews in the entire world. So when the Nazis set upon this killing process, they really didn't know how, they were winging it. They started by shooting the Jews in ditches. I won't say typically, but dramatically in 1949 near Kiev, they machine gunned 39,000 men, women, and children, Jews, in a ravine at Babi Yar. But eventually, they found that shooting Jews was too difficult for the German soldiers, because a lot of them got upset at shooting babies and women, and all this correspondence is in German, and I have copies of it, and the letters that went between Russia after the Barbarossa, after the Nazis invaded Russia, and Berlin, of how it was demoralizing for the German soldiers to have to kill all these people. They weren't even, they were referred to as Puppen or puppets. They weren't human beings. And as a result of this, they started building gas fans. They were moving trucks, and the exhaust gas was fed into the box. And then somebody said, why are we driving these trucks around? They were breaking down because of the bad Russian roads, and some murderous brain in the SS said, we don't need the truck, we only need the engine. So they got a Russian diesel engine at a place called Chelno, installed it outside of a house, taped up the windows, stuffed the room full of Jews, and within 15 minutes they were all dead. And that was the invention of the gas chambers. So once the Nazis developed a method of industrial scale murder, the final solution, or the Endlösung, came to Western Europe, and the Jews from Holland and Belgium and France and other Western occupied countries started to be deported. And in Holland, the Jews were taken a nightly arrest to a place called Westerbork, which was right on the, I think I'm gonna just show you where it is. It was right over here. It was a camp that was built to house German Jewish refugees. The Dutch didn't want the German Jewish refugees in Holland before the war, but they didn't want to refuse them either. So they built a camp over right over here called Westerbork, and we lived in Amsterdam. Go back to that one. So every night there were the arrests of Jews, mostly in Amsterdam and The Hague, and these Jews were brought to Westerbork, which on the German border. It was not a concentration camp; it was a transit camp where Jews were held, and they had the Jews built a school. I mean, to the German, they were all Jews to be killed, but it also included the best and the brightest. There were famous conductors and authors and painters and academicians, the best and the brightest. So the Jews established some schools for the kids. People weren't being murdered, and everybody's greatest wish was to stay in Westerbork, because as bad as it was, people were not being murdered. But every week on Tuesday, a train pulled into Westerbork. You can see the train tracks over here. And it was loaded with approximately 1,000 Jews. Their names were posted on a list. I still have the list with our names. The train would pull out to an unknown destination. The train would return all clean, and no one ever heard from these people again. So every Tuesday was a horrendous day with people crying and screaming and trying to help their neighbor get their few belongings together, and they disappeared. This was Westerbork. I always thought of it as a Western town. I remember it. This was about the time that I was 6 years old. No, I was 5 still. It was just about the time when my conscious memory began, but without context. But there were dusty streets. There were flies all over. People lived in these barracks, which you see on the right. But life in its own way went on. And again, the important thing is the Jews were not being murdered, and they would have been happy, in quotes, to stay there. What do these trains mean? Here are the numbers. There were about 107 trains that left Westerbork for the east every Tuesday. Of 19 trains of about 34,000 Jews left Westerbork to go to Sobibor, a place that no one knew or recognized the name. It was a place where your life ended within 40 minutes. At the end of the war, 19 Dutch Jews or Jews from Holland were still alive, 19 out of 34,000. 68 trains of 55,000 people went to Auschwitz. At the end of the war, about 1,000 Jews from Holland were alive. 7 trains went to Terezin or Terezin in Czechoslovakia, but that was a way station to Auschwitz. And most of the Jews, that was what was called the model camp in order to fool the Red Cross and the rest of the world. But the Jews there were periodically moved to Auschwitz and gassed. And about 9 trains went to Bergen-Belsen. The word luck pops up again. It was the only place, really the only place, it was the only place where a Jewish child under the age of 15 could possibly survive, because in Sobibor and Auschwitz, all Jewish children under the age of 15 were murdered upon arrival, usually with their mother and anyone seen not fit or able to work. So again, of the 107,000 Jews that were deported from Holland to the camps at the end of the war, about 5,000 were alive. and that included 800 who were still in Westerbork and really in no danger. In theory, the Germans could have shot them, but they didn't. So actually only about over 4,000 Jews who were deported to the actual camps out of 107 survived the war. By far the worst death toll anywhere in Western Europe. My father, by the way, said to my mother, I always had bad ear infections, and there was no medical care, and the Nazis preferred to put families on the trains. Why? Everything has a why, because if you put one person on a train, you have one, but if you have a family, you have four, typically. So it was a lot easier to get the 1,000 Jews for a train by picking a family. And my father said to my mother, let's try and get a train to Bergen-Belsen. And he said to her, when the war ends, it'll be easier to get back to Holland. He didn't know anything. All he knew was that Bergen-Belsen was in northern Germany, and he thought that if they could manage to volunteer for a train, and no one was volunteering for a train, if he could volunteer for a train to Bergen-Belsen, it would be easier for us. Clearly, as it turned out, it saved our lives. But of course, at the time, he didn't know that. No one knew that. Here's an actual train. We were in cattle cars. That's the train track you saw on the map. The train arrived Monday night, and Tuesday was the horror of filling all those cattle cars. And these are actual photographs taken in Westerbork. The man over here was the camp police. He was Jewish, but the Nazis assigned some of the Jews just to keep order. Obviously controversial, but I'll simply say that everybody wanted to stay alive, and everybody worked to their own advantage. It was just the way it is. So you have here I won't say a Dutch policeman, because they too were murdered, but for the time being, he wasn't. But here you see a little child who would have been dead within the next 2 days, depending on what camp that train was going to. Auschwitz was 5 days. Bergen-Belsen was 1 day. You see a little girl over here. She would have been dead 45 minutes after arrival. And here you see the other people, dark, filthy trains, no food, no water, no toilets. Typically 10% of the people died and on the train. I mean, they went all young, healthy people. They were old people. They were sick people. They were newborn babies. So about 10% when the trains arrived at the destination were dead. The trains coming from Russia in the winter, open trains, typically all of them were dead, frozen to death. But this is the train in Westerbork. Show you the trip that we took. Here's Westerbork, here's Amsterdam. We went from Amsterdam to Westerbork, right on the border, and then to Bergen-Belsen. The death camps are defined by the use of poison gas were all in Poland, and they were all over here. Here's Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek, Sobibor, where most of the Dutch were gassed, Treblinka, where most of the Warsaw Ghetto people were gassed. There were 6 of them, all in Poland, out of sight, and as far as the Germans were considered, out of mind. But a trip like that was about 5 days, and again, about 10% of the people were dead by the time they got there. But Bergen-Belsen was a 1-day trip from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen up near Hanover in northern Germany. It was a huge camp. We were actually in what's called the Star Camp, because we did not wear striped uniforms, but we wore the clothing we had, which included the yellow Judenstern, or Jewish star, that all Jews had to wear whenever they went outside. There were Russians, there were POWs, there were Hungarians, but we were in what was called the Sternlager, or the Star Camp. Again, Bergen-Belsen, unheated barracks, and the climate was very similar to where I live, Rochester, pleasant in the summer and spring, freezing cold in the winter. These barracks were unheated. By the way, all these photographs were taken after the British liberated the camp on April 15th, 1945. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire. It was electrified. The barracks, there were no toilets. There was dysentery, typhus. People died from starvation, torture, disease, exposure, usually disease and starvation. The food was about 600 calories a day of a kohlrabi soup. My father weighed about 90 pounds. I weighed about 40 pounds. So here were the barracks. Again, these photographs were taken after the British liberated the camp. You slept two to a bunk. You can't call it a bed, and there were three high, and there was no heat. I'll tell you a quick story. It's the kind of things you'll never read it anywhere, and you'll never hear it anywhere. These bunks had ticking, sort of, again, words fail me. I can't really call it a mattress because it wasn't. It was ticking, filled with straw. But the camp was filled with lice, and so the Jews, the inmates, would take the ticking and burn it in a potbelly stove at the end, but that didn't last. Underneath were wooden slats that were just placed there. So the Jews would take one plank out of each bunk and use it for fuel, and then they would spread out the remaining planks so that the crack for the missing plank would not be so wide. But that board got burned up to heat the barrack, so they took another board, and you had a bigger space to space out. And so they would again move the remaining boards till finally you couldn't remove any more slats, and you were sleeping on a wooden board with the edge cutting into your emaciated body. Bergen-Belsen was, although it was not a death camp in the sense that of gas chambers, it was probably the most notorious because of these photographs that came out right after the war. There were 10,000 unburied bodies. In the morning, quite often the person that you shared a bunk with would die. I was shared a bunk with a rather heavy-set woman. I mean, people arrived as they were, and some were heavier than others. And one morning she was dead, and I recall it being one of my better days. I had the bunk to myself. The prisoners still alive would strip the clothing for their use. There was no one to bury bodies. The prisons were too weak, so there were about 50,000 Jews were murdered or died in Bergen-Belsen, including Anne Frank, her sister Margot. At any time, there were about 10,000 unburied bodies that simply, here were barracks, here was a guard station over here, and all over the place were bodies. My sister and I learned to count on bodies because they were all twisted up. You couldn't tell which arm belonged to which body. And my sister and I assume what other children that might have been alive would just stare and try and figure out what heads belong to what bodies and what arms, and it was what it was. This was after liberation. This photograph was interesting to me because the prisoners were the Jews, there were others, there were Russian POWs, but principally Jews, were so dehumanized that they were the animals that the Nazis accused them of being. And this photograph illustrates something interesting. You see prisoners, again, the photographs were taken after April 15th. You see prisoners walking down a path or whatever, and then you see these two people over here. Well, if you look, that is their bathroom. They were leaving themselves. But the point is, no one even would look or notice. If you passed the site like that, you would be totally grossed out. You would be shocked, but no one even notices because the Jews were just totally dehumanized. This photograph also, again, all over bodies. But the interesting thing about the photograph is these women. They're peeling a potato, which was the lifeline of a camp. And again, most people couldn't even stand. This woman here is just lying there. And so here they are cooking a potato outside, oblivious to the thousands of corpses a few feet behind them. And here you see a woman looking for a relative, a loved one, a friend. But again, people just became numbed to the horror. And my sister and I and other children, that was our everyday. That's what we saw. And I hate to use the word normal, but that's what we saw, and that's what we thought everybody saw. At the end, all the British could do was bring a bulldozer out and excavate several huge holes, ditches, and just shove all the unknown bodies into a ditch and cover them up. The camp was so riddled with typhus that the British had to burn it down. By this time, my sister and I and 2,000 other Jews had left in one of 3 trains, later called the Lost Transport, which meandered the German countryside. It was the end of the war, but not yet quite the end. And 675 people on the train died on the train or shortly thereafter. And finally, that train was liberated in the East German farming village of Turbitz. So that photograph was taken probably a week or so after we had been transported. That's my sister, and that's me in better times. When we came to America on January 1st, 1947, under Queen Elizabeth, this still chokes me up, I don't know why. My parents woke us up to see the Statue of Liberty, which didn't mean much to a 7-year-old, actually a 9-year-old. But my sister had a birthday party for friends and relatives a few years ago, and I hired a tour boat. And I said to my sister, who I call Zus, which is Dutch for Dutch diminutive for Zusje, sister. I said, let's take a picture and sort of relive a long time ago. And that is the end. And I think Abby's going to come on. I've used my 45 minutes plus 2 minutes. And there you are, Abby.
Hi, Stephen. So we do have some questions. And of course, for those who are watching in Zoom, you can type questions in the Q&A function. And for those watching on Facebook, please feel free to type a question into the comment section on Facebook. So one of the questions that we have is, how did you get the different artifacts, such as the deportation list, with your names on it?
Oh, I had survivors, and this is also very typical, hardly ever spoke about it. I thought we were the only ones. My parents never brought it up. My father used to have one of two. When I was a typical annoying teenager and complaining about whatever, my father would always say, "You had it worse," or he'd say, well, he'd either say you had it worse, or he'd say, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." That's as far as we went. But actually, back in 1984, I think it was, when President Reagan went to Bitburg, which is very controversial, because Adenauer at the time wanted to draw a line under the Germans as being forever the perpetrators, and Reagan wanted to accommodate him, and went to Bitburg, was a cemetery where GIs from the Battle of the Bulge were buried, but there was also a section where SS troops were buried, and this caused tremendous controversy in the US. And for the first time ever in my life, I wrote a letter to the editor. I remember it started, as a survivor, as a Navy officer, as an American, I protest. And I wrote this letter and started getting a lot of calls, a little bit of hate mail, and started an obsession, I guess, and started teaching. And people asked me, would you come to a school? And you can't see it here, but I have a library behind me, to the side of me, of about 1,000 books. I've spent 40 years, I guess, obsessing about it.
Well, our next question is actually about, I think, the map that you had of Bergen-Belsen. about what is the neutrals camp?
Oh, the neutrals camp, they did have prisoners from Sweden and Switzerland. Some people who they were Jews, they were caught in the trap. And also our camp, supposedly it was called an Austauschlager, which means exchange camp. That's one reason why we wore the clothing we had. The Germans had some idea that they would, a lot of people, including my parents, had purchased phony Paraguayan or other South American passports, and the Germans, they were onto that racket, but the Germans thought they could swap these prominent Jews, people with connections or family overseas, for trucks and to exchange for German nationals who were imprisoned overseas. So again, the camp, the Sternlager, the store camp, was actually the Austauschlager. About 2,000 Jews actually were transferred, but it only happened once.
And another question is, what was the typical population of Bergen-Belsen?
It was somewhere between 50 and 75,000. This Bergen-Belsen came online late in the war. It was a military compound, and late in 1942 or early 43, it became a concentration camp. And the camp was, I use words, you do the best you can. It was survivable. People died by the dozens a month. But then later on, when the Soviets started approaching Eastern occupied Europe, and the death marches started, including again Anne Frank and her sister Margot across Germany. And of course, the Germans will say, we knew nothing. Well, they didn't look out the window. Bergen-Belsen became totally overcrowded, and the entire infrastructure collapsed. And then it became so disease-ridden. There was basically no food. And again, I didn't know what a toothbrush was for well over a year. My mother used to brush her teeth like this. She'd put her finger in rainwater, and I still remember that. If you pick your toothbrush, the dentist, quick little brush up. There were no toilets. You went wherever you went, and you didn't dare sit down. They had these latrines that looked the sort of gallows humor. The Jews called them egg racks because of the oval holes, and of course whether you're male or female, no one cared. But no one dared sit down because I don't want to go into the whole description, but you can imagine with dysentery what it looked like. But the people were so weak that they couldn't sort of crouch, and they fell into it. And of course, disease spread like wildfire. But the total death toll was over 50,000. And the most interesting, not interesting, but the most illustrating part of it is that 13,000 Jews died after the liberation. After the British were there with all their efforts, 13,000 Jews still died because they were too far gone. In fact, when we were liberated by the Russians, and my father was an expert at stealing food from farms or whenever, so there was food. My parents were very careful to apportion food, because starving people, you suddenly have an intake of food, your body can't handle it, and it's just, you have an internal explosion, and people died. And I remember it was mostly Spam. I can't look at a can of Spam, but I still remember it had a key that you turn around, and they were called canned goods victims, the people who stuffed themselves with food, but their body couldn't process it, and they died.
Another question that came in is, were you ever separated from your parents?
No, only Bergen-Belsen was, well, not Bergen-Belsen so much, but the Sternlager, because we were seen as privileged Jews. I mean, no privileges, but privileged Jews in the sense that we had to the Germans some trade, some border value. They kept families together, but it could be in neighboring barracks. But we saw our parents at night when they came back from slave labor, and they left in the morning at 6 o'clock. You had to stand in whatever clothing you had, at assembly, which was called appel. Assembly. This is weird. This goes back 70 years. I still remember this. Ditty, appel, dann macht der Jude schnell. Appel, the Jew hurries up. And you would stand in the freezing cold. If you didn't have shoes, you died. And people constantly sagged and died, and they would start counting again. This could last for hours and resulted in the death of thousands of people over time. My sister and I were there was so much malnutrition. I wish we had more time, because I had asked all these things of my mother, like, how did you handle having two small children? And my mother said, we would sit somewhere where we were put outside or whatever and didn't move, because when you starve, your body shuts down and your brain functions get reduced. Your heart and lungs still fight for survival, but reproductive systems or other organs give it up. And so my mother said that my sister and I were, her exact words were, totally gray. And I didn't know, I thought she would say that she couldn't, that seeing us so dirty and hungry and unhappy, but she didn't say that. She said we were just gray. We just didn't move. We didn't complain. We hardly spoke. We just sat there. And I have to assume that was typical with other children as well, but children only survived 8 to 10 weeks.
We are getting a few questions about your parents and, and after the war, and what your feelings were after the war and what happened to your parents.
Well, we came here on January 1st, 1947, arrived in New York, where my father's sister and husband and his parents lived on the west side in a crummy, small apartment. But first, I remember my father calling us together and saying, we're now Americans and we're going to speak English. But the problem was that we didn't know English. We had not been to school. We went to school and they didn't know where to put us because we were too old for kindergarten. So they put us, I think it was in the 3rd grade, just to start us somewhere. And eventually, after 6 months, neither my sister nor I spoke Dutch again. We just forgot it. I know maybe half a dozen words. It was different. I think my sister adjusted better. I never developed to this very day. I could never play sports, and therefore you're sort of rejected by other boys. I didn't know. I never attended. I still haven't attended a sporting event. Never played a sport. Felt like an outsider. But on the other hand, I remember we went when we came here. My parents, with relatives, went to a restaurant. We hadn't restaurant, didn't know what that was. And I stole all the bread that was on the table. And we got back to the apartment, and my mother locked all the locks on the doors in New York. And I put my hand in my pocket, and I had 4 or 5 rolls. I put them on the table, and my mother said to me, I no longer needed to do that. I was a bit of a pack rat. I think my sister did a better job of getting over it and developing. It's interesting because my wife is a psychiatrist, and I asked her, do I show any symptoms, from the time? And she said to me, I'm not your therapist. I said, just give me a yes or no. She said, yes. And I realized that I'm an extremely fussy eater. I eat maybe 10 things, no meat, no fish, nothing that looks foreign. I don't like to travel. I have a certain discomfort about travel. So I have a certain things in me, but I don't know what they are.
Another question is about if you and other Jewish families were able to continue to practice the Jewish faith in the barracks.
There are stories about people holding a Seder in the barracks. There was a total cross section of ultra-Orthodox Jews. Hardly any of them survived, and very assimilated Jews. It was civilization pushed into hell. So yes, there were, my own sense is if you arrived religious, you kept it, especially if you survived. If you arrived, again, we were too young, we didn't think that way. But in looking back, for me personally, religion has no place whatsoever. I mean, I can't equate Auschwitz to religion, but I'm only speaking for myself. There are fewer and fewer, but there are enough survivors who are very observant. So there was no open ceremony of religion in any of the camps because it was forbidden. But some people tried to maintain some sort of religious life.
And another question is, how did you and your family work to recover, emotionally?
I don't think we did. Uh, the My mother was the sickest of all. She had typhus, and had we not been rescued from this, liberated from the train, she would have been gone in another week or two. She was ill. My father had been very successful, and later on in life, when my own demons caught up with me and I had more understanding, I sort of had the feeling that my father in some ways was a broken person. Of course, he survived, but he had to start here in New York, sweeping floors and rebuilding. He was in his early 40s. All his success was gone, and well, you can say, well, but you survived, and 6 million died, and all that is true, but that doesn't really help you when you're trying to support a family. So he had to. He was gone from Monday to Friday on the road selling textiles. It was very difficult for him, and we just didn't talk about it. My mother was very supportive and very nurturing. I remember my sister always. I remember she's on the list. She's probably waving to me or whatever. Anyway, Marion was always very popular, had lots of friends, and I think she did a better job of it than I did. But some things, when I got to college, when I went to Columbia, and my father was fairly insistent that I join the military. He said it wasn't his expression, but he was telling me it's payback time. And right behind me is the ship I served on for 2 years as a Navy officer. It was one of the best times in my life. I'm very proud of it. So I was in 4 years, and my wife and I and my family were very pro-military, and we're patriots. We just are. We fly the flag every day. So each of us went our own way. We recovered, and I don't have survivor's guilt. I'm absolutely happy at age 83 that I'm still around.
Well, and I think we could be here almost all night, with questions. We've had some really wonderful questions, and I thank you everyone for all the questions that you're putting in the chat and the comments. One of the questions that I think maybe we'll leave with this one, Steve, is do you feel that history repeats itself?
Well, I don't. I mean, what do I know? Of course, history repeats itself, but I think that the Holocaust. Now we have different fears today. I mean, we have weapons that can destroy the entire world. One ballistic submarine carries more destruction than Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So we have other things now, and the fact that the Holocaust has taught, well, what can happen. I mean, I'm personally, I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and that's part of the Jews were so helpless. They had it wouldn't have made a difference, but they had no way to defend themselves, and I would never want that to happen to me. So I don't think the Holocaust per se can happen again, but I worry about Israel. They're surrounded by enemies, So who knows? I really don't have the answer. By the
Well,
way,
you know, yes.
I see some questions popping up. Please,
Oh.
some kind words. Just please thank your audience for being so hospitable.
Oh, yes, we're getting a lot of thank yous for this evening for your talk. And Steve, thank you. I can't thank you enough for taking the time tonight to speak with all of us here online. And I hope that you'll be able to come and visit us here at the World War II Museum when it's safe to do so. At this time, I also want to thank again Toby Philanthropies for being our sponsor for tonight's program. And then as well, I want to thank all of you for watching tonight. Thank you so much for joining us here at the National World War II Museum. And I hope that you'll join us again soon. So thank you and
Well,
good night.
Well, you know, the Jews say next year in Jerusalem. I'll say next year in New Orleans. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.